next speaker will be Christian Guzman, psychologist from Peru, who will share some findings of his study on masculinities among various indigenous communities in Cusco. Feel free to introduce yourself briefly, and we are happy to listen to your presentation, Christian.
Thank you, Rachel. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yes?
Sure.
No?
Speak loudly here.
Now?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. It was me. Hello. I want to start saying thank you to the organizers and especially to Promundo colleagues who invite me to be here today. I want to thank you all also for being here this afternoon. My name is Christian Guzman, and I work in a university called Cayetano Heredia in Peru, in the public health faculty. I'm a researcher and a practitioner in gender and violence intervention programs with men. And since the last year, I'm the coordinator of a perpetrators counseling program called Programa de Hombres que Renuncian a su Violencia, or Program of Men Who Renounce, Who Give Up to Their Violence, which was started in 2004 by the Professor Miguel Ramos, adapting to Peruvian context the work model developed by a pioneer organization on engaging men for gender equality in Latin America called CORIAC, a Mexican organization. Besides the work we make at the university with perpetrators, by the way, a couple of months ago we just hit our first 10 years. We are very proud of that. Besides that work, since about 5 years ago, we started to explore different ways related to primary prevention efforts. In that field, we have been supporting, for example, UNFPA Peruvian office in adapting age program for working with young men and boys in violence prevention and promotion of gender equality in urban and peripheric urban communities in the context of Peruvian jungle. This year, we started also a first step in the paternity field, mainly with the aim of testing a new strategy for working with men in contexts that could be felt as more friendly for men than, a perpetrator counseling program. But also because we wanted to go deep in something we have been finding repeatedly during our work. When men gain connection with their own experience as a son, when a child, and the violence they have experienced in that context, they get more likely to be cracked, for a lack of a better term, in the sense that they put down lots of barriers and defenses toward change. And then they are more willing not only to stop their violence, but also to be more engaged in activities related to care of their childs and their houses and etc., like cleaning the house, like cooking. Well, this work is still exploratory, but we are very enthusiastic so far about our initial findings. Another activity in which we have been involved since the past 2 years, also with the UNFPA and the Peruvian Women's Ministry, is the development process of the first national policy related to engage men as community leaders in gender violence prevention activities, implemented for public employees in charge of the implementation of the Gender Violence Prevention National Strategy. This year, this new experience has been tested in different urban and rural areas all around the country. And last but not least, since this year, we are also involved in a very challenging, demanding, but also rewarding project in the highlands of rural Cusco. Cusco, as you may know, is the capital of the, Inca Empire, Machu Picchu, where Machu Picchu is located. During the year some history about that. During the year 1999 and 2000, we were involved in the WHO multi-country study on violence against women and the impacts on their health. We, the university, conduct the study for Peru. As you may know, this study took part in 10 different countries, 2 geographical zones, each one rural, one urban. In Peru was in Cusco and Lima, respectively. This study was about prevalence of violence during the lifespan. Very diverse countries participated in that study, including Japan, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Brazil, Namibia, etc. Peru scored at the top of the highest prevalence of violence. 2 in 3 women have suffered any kind of violence during their lives in Cusco. Cusco was at the top of the list of the 20 countries. 2 of 3. 2 in 3. And Lima was the 3rd. 1 in 2. 1 in 2 women have suffered of any kind of violence during their lifetime, mainly from their couples, from their intimate partners. These results not include psychological violence. It doesn't include psychological violence. So now this new project, which calls, by the way, Huayquipura, which is a Quechua composed word, which means literally between brothers, in between brothers. This new project we're starting just now allow us to have the chance 10 years later to come back to this so complex reality to try to make some challenges, to try to make some changes, which is very challenging, as we have been doing in other places. Well, as you can see, we have been very busy. We have been very busy. And we have been traveling a lot all around Peru, which is a very big, vast, and diverse country. We have many different languages and cultures. We have coasts, we have highlands, we have jungle. So cultural issues are always a concern in our work. That's why I want to bring some points to reflection emerged from our research and intervention experiences. For starters, even if it might be taken as an obvious thing, I want to frame my discussion on culture, understanding it as a very fluid notion, always in movement, changing, and interconnected with other social categories. I want to give some context for gaining a bigger picture on culture and gender in my country. For example, Creole culture, or cultura criolla, and the so-called mestizaje, is a social strategy to blur the differences and the diversity of cultures coexisting, oppressing, and resisting between each other during different regimes through history, from the Incas empire to the present, the ruling of economy based on high-pressure extractive industries like gold or silver mining. Well, also I like to speak about some of the main conclusions of one fundamental work for understanding the linkages between gender and culture in Peru, but I think I have not too much time. Maybe I'm going to leave that for together. Yeah. Well, I want to address a bit about, trying to conclude, I want to address a bit about the use of culture in these many contexts. The use of culture can have two different meanings, okay? One is related to a masculine discursive strategy for trying to stop, as a backlash also, in front to women's change into the context of my current research in rural highlands of Cusco. In this case, the notion of culture is static, refers to the Inca past, the Inca Empire past, previous to the colony, as a better vision of life, and has a strong vision of compulsory complementarity, or complementaridad, between men and women, with very rigid gender roles that give, as a result, tremendous disempowerment of women, in front of which men doesn't want to take a stand because they even doesn't see it. For example, women don't take part of communal leaderships, in the communal associations. Also, I want to address the other meaning related to culture, specifically speaking about el buen vivir, or what can be translated as well-being. It's a very important notion in the Andes for understanding the world and the universe itself, the whole life. This concept can be used in order to visibilize oppression and dynamize change. The arguments are related, of the men in this, of the research I'm conducting in this particular context, are related to the exhaustion of being a male in contexts so fairly excluded. For example, one of the better opportunities of being a provider for the family is going to work in coca plantation fields, illegal coca plantation fields, or into illegal medium-scale mining. In both options, there are not police stations very kilometers around, and in 1 minute. There are not police stations many kilometers around, there are not clinical service, and there's not any presence of the state. These men in this context themselves says and has the permanent feeling that their lives doesn't work. They say, mi vida no vale nada aquí. Here, I can be shot by a coca, for a drug lord, por un señor de la droga, and nothing gonna happen. But I have to do this in order to be a provider for my family. This situation is obviously due to a larger structural domination and discrimination and multiple oppressions. But it's important for these men, one, to be able to be aware that this situation also affects the women. So they are and they even must to be together in order to be able to fight against that oppression that they share as indigenous people. And they have to be able to speak their exhaustion related to this model of being men far beyond their symptoms, because the violence they use against the women can be very vile, very. Okay, I'm finishing here. Okay, maybe later I can add some other points. Thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you, Christian, from bringing experiences from around complexity around manhood from Peru on the table. And I think in your presentation it's also clear how various well, categories of oppression are very much interconnected with each other, and as a reaction, the reaction of man to well, what you say, culture as an excuse to really preserve the traditional manhood as a form of identity. Thank you. Well, our next and last speaker is Mr. Sanjay Srivastava, excuse me, of the Indian Institute of Growth. Shwanda will take us a bit to masculinity issues in connection to the new president of India, President Modi.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sanjay Srivastava. I'm actually now at a new institution, not new, but at another institution. I'm a sociologist, and I work at Jawaharlal Nehru University. What I want to do quickly is read really, really fast so I can beat that masculinist time clock there. Okay, my paper is called Modi Masculinity, Media Traditions and Traditions in a Time of Consumerism. What I want to look at is and some of my previous speakers, my co-panelists, have touched upon some of these topics. What does it mean to be a man within the larger context, different kind of discourses that produce masculinity, political economy, neoliberalism, globalization, the state, for example. And I want to do this through focusing upon India's newly elected Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, because during the election campaign just concluded, in which his party won by a massive majority and through which he became the Prime Minister, his masculinity was a significant aspect of the election campaign. So people talked about his forceful masculinity, the fact that he was decisive, that he would get rid of the policy paralysis that had apparently struck his predecessor government, and the earlier Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, was often portrayed as being an effeminate type, someone who couldn't take strong decisions, someone who couldn't stand up to external threats like Pakistan and China, and to so-called internal threats like terrorists. And so Modi's personality was presented very much in terms of both embodied terms. You know, he was presented as masculine because he had this, as it was said, a 56-inch chest. So I want to look at the discourses that produced this and the appeal of Modi in terms of his voters. Now, the political valence of Modi, of the media discourse on Modi masculinity became soon very easily accepted. People started his opponents started talking about it. And instead of saying, well, opponents started disputing it. And to dispute something is to also recognize simultaneously that this person is in fact that, and I will undermine it by disputing it. So, for example, one opposition minister told a newspaper that Mr. Modi could never become Prime Minister because he had never married. Of course, he had married, but he wasn't living with his wife, right? That he was not a real man. So even in disputing his masculinity, there was a wider recognition that indeed there was something to be said about his masculinity. Another Congress party, an opposition party spokesperson said of Modi that he was impotent. Because he didn't stop. There was in 2002 in Gujarat, the state of Gujarat, of which Modi was the chief minister at that particular point in time, witnessed a massive pogrom against Muslims, and this Congress opposition party, now in the opposition party spokesperson said that in fact Mr. Modi was napunsak. He said he was impotent because he never stopped that carnage. So in fact the entire dialogue, entire discourse about Modi became about his masculinity, not so much in the act of disputing his masculinity. Of course it reinforced the notion that here was a man whose masculinity then needed to be questioned. So now, I want to suggest to you that although Modi's masculinity, which was also used by his own party to present him as an ideal candidate who would bring greater glory to India in being decisive, etc., in fact borrows and is positioned within contemporary consumer culture and addresses many of the anxieties that many men who feel in terms of the changing structures of work, the fact that many women are working, the fact that many women are becoming consumers, and the consuming woman in many post-colonial societies is a figure of some anxiety. So that because women are not meant to be consumers traditionally, they were meant to be sacrifices, they were meant to look after their husbands and brothers and give up their consumerist desires in favor of what their husbands and brothers want to do. And I want to suggest to you that what Modi does is reconciles what Mr. Modi's personality does is to reconcile both an idea of being essentially Indian, but also being global. So that, and there are two terms that I want to use here in order to give you a background of what I want to say before I conclude in terms of why I think that The Modi masculinity presents a particular model of masculinity which assuages certain kinds of contemporary masculine identities on the part of men who are located in frameworks of work and leisure and home that are rapidly changing. The two frameworks that I want to utilize here, one is I want to refer to as post-nationalism. I think many post-colonial societies are living in an era of post-nationalism. That is, a period where, a time where earlier ideas of nationalism immediately following colonialism no longer exist. So the notions of sacrifice, for example, notions that the state is supreme, the fact that the nation should be, the idea of nation building, I think many of those ideas have substantially declined. Increasingly by post-nationalism, the term post-nationalism, I mean a context whereby the nation idea still exists, but it is increasingly accepted, for example, that the nation and the private sector can collaborate. So in many post-colonial countries, public-private partnerships are deemed to be completely acceptable. So post-nationalism is a particular nationalist sentiment that has emerged over the last 20, 25 years in the context of consumerist modernity, whether the state is no longer seen as that sacrosanct state that emerged immediately after the colonial period, and privatization is a significant aspect of what I present to you as post-nationalism. I'll come back to that. The other context that I want to suggest to you, that aspect, the term that I want to use in order to analyze Modi masculinity is moral consumption. In many post-colonial societies, with the rise of consumerism in the last 25 years, especially in South Asia, there is now a dialogue about what is it to be truly Indian, for example, because of a historical, certainly in the modern period, bias against consumerism. So immediately following the end of colonial rule, there was a particular masculine type which emerged in film, cinema, that I want to refer to as a 5-year plan hero. He saved, right? He was in films, he saved for the nation. Consumerism itself was considered a bad thing. And this is linked to nationalist movements. In many countries, we have nationalist movements. The idea was that one saved for the nation. Consumption was a bad thing. In fact, one of the strongest criticism of in South Africa, for example, in my familiarity, of those former ANC members who've become capitalists, as it were, is that they've abandoned the revolution. So nationalist movements in post-colonial countries carry this notion that one must not consume. Consumption is a bad thing. Moral consumption, in my reading, is a particular contemporary context which combines the notion that one can still be moral and nationalist but still be a consumer. Okay, so post-national moral consumption. Okay. Now, what I think the personality of Narendra Modi does is to if I can find my page number, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, so I want to suggest to you that Modi masculinity stands at the crossroads of post-nationalism and moral consumption. That is, Modi masculinity, the figure of Narendra Modi, presents that person who can both be of the world but also of the home. He is that particular person who continues to have control over the home but also engages with the global world. That is to say, he continues to be someone who's forceful, simultaneously as someone who is a consumer. That is someone who has a hold over the domestic as well as the global sphere. Now, the context, I'm using the idea of moral consumption in order to talk about a particular context where consumption is not necessarily condemned. So the idea of moral consumption here in this particular context also links us to the other broad ideas that we come across very often, which is the notion of neoliberalism. How do we understand contemporary political economy in terms of what people are experiencing? So on the one hand, so one of the problems with neoliberalism is, of which consumerist modernity is an aspect, that it offers the possibility to everyone, men and women, of become consumers. But the consuming woman, the woman who can go out and earn, who is able to spend on herself, is also a figure of anxiety in terms of masculinity. But no one, on the other hand, is not in favor of neoliberalism. People are largely in favor of privatization. People are largely in favor of consumerist modernity. I think what the figure of Narendra Modi does is offers a reconciliation whereby one can both be of the world, one can be a consumer, but along with Modi's various utterances in public life about the importance of the family, about what women should do, about the significance of Indian traditions, that one can have both. One can have have both tradition, but also have its apparent obverse. Now, the ironic thing for me is that this notion, this reconciliation, which we normally associate Modi's party, as many of you know, subscribe to Hindu cultural nationalism. Usually we think of Hindu cultural nationalism as a throwback to the past, that it is reaching out for something that is in the past. In fact, what is happening here is not at all a throwback to the past, but something that is being produced in the crucibles of contemporary modernity. That is that this going backwards and forwards between tradition and modernity is an aspect of consumer culture in itself, in as much as consumer culture is about choice. So here you have the possibility of a masculinity mediated through the notion of consumption itself, because consumption offers you that choice. You can have all of it. You can have it all. So here you have a particular model of masculinity that says you can have both. You can have both the world and the home. And ironically, of course, it is through it is located within a context which we think of as a context that leads to the breakdown of older structures of power. What I'm suggesting to you here is that contemporary modernity, contemporary consumerism, and with Modi masculinity as iconic masculine figure, is not so much a breakdown of power, but a reinstitution of masculine power in a new context of a new context of modernity. Okay, but I just want to conclude by saying that this is not classic neoliberalism. Because classic neoliberalism is about the self-regulating, autonomous individual. This is a masculine figure who is both part of an enterprise culture, a neoliberal culture, but also part of subscribe very strongly to older structures of power, such as family, kinship, and the role of the father. So it's not that Western classical neoliberal figure that we often think about, we often talk about, when we use the term neoliberalism quite liberally. But I think what is happening in many post-colonial societies, such as India, is a neoliberal figure which is a product of what I would like to refer to as traditional modernity, rather than a completely autonomous figure, because he is located both within larger contexts of neoliberalism as the autonomous subject, but also draws his continuing efficacy in power from also subscribing to older structures of power. So it's not the classic enterprising subject. So we have, what I want to suggest to you, a traditional modernity that's produced a particularly assuaging, a model of masculinity that provides comfort. And these are some of the ways that I wanted to link what happens to everyday embodied selves of masculinity, what happens to people in everyday lives, and broader structures that are happening, broader changes that are happening. So we have, a traditional modernity that produces a traditionally modern masculinity through the context consumer culture and through the context of choice, because after all, choice is that particular way of thinking about the world which says you can have this and that. And these are some of the ways I think that we can think about masculinity as being located in the wider structures, the changes that we think about consumerism, neoliberalism, change ahead of both in control of the home, but also engage with the wider world of consumption and hence be in control of the world as well. A context that is not outside the process of modernity, but produced for the process of modernity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I think you managed quite well in a very brief short time to give us to take us on a navigating journey between how your new president is navigating between the neoliberal global world and trying to link that with embedding in family norms and values. And it would be interesting to invite you at the next Menegate Symposium and to see what has happened then. Then we will hear what whether there are elements of a backlash, the risk of a backlash, or he is able to navigate in that, to play that role, and maybe as an example for many other places in the world.